I hate fitness content as a fitness content creator. So here's why. Two versions, short and long. Short version, I hate fitness content because much of it is actually just entertainment that is kind of pretending to be education. Right? If you want to actually learn something on social media, you need to find creators who give context to their claims and who aren't being hyperbolic about everything. That's the short version. Here's the long version. There are two major types of content on social media. One type is education, the other type is entertainment. Of course, these aren't rigid categories, right? Education content can and does often entertain, while pure entertainment can contain elements of education, right? When educational content is optimized, though, for education, it's far more informative than entertaining, right? You watch education-related content to learn a new skill or ways to think. You don't watch education to laugh, scream, or cry, at least hopefully. So education content simply just needs to be entertaining enough to watch, but no more and no less. Pure entertainment content, however, has no educational value or at least no necessity for it, right? Education content creators therefore have this issue, right? They have this issue of needing to investigate how they can make their content more engaging, while pure entertainers aren't really required to teach anyone anything, right? I don't click on a Mr. Beast video because I'm interested in improving my cognition, but rather because I just want to shut my brain off for, 10 or 15 minutes. I don't really watch Mr. Beast, but you get the point. Content that's made for pure entertainment appeals to wider audiences, right? So this is a problem, right? Why? Because many content creators, like myself, post on social media to educate. And so what I hate about this relationship is that many content creators in the fitness space create entertainment content that is disguised as educational, right? And so you might ask yourself, well, how do they get away with this? I can't think of any. Well, think of it this way. Many people who are trying to learn about a topic don't know very much about the topic. That's why they're watching to begin with, to learn more about a topic, right? And because the many don't know much about a topic, it's very difficult for them to discern between people providing real education and people who make entertainment disguised as education, right? So to compete with entertainment channels, real educational creators often feel pressure to degrade their content with gimmicky titles and thumbnails, rapid fire edits, flashy visuals, and worst of all, quiet trap music in the background of every video. And while there's nothing wrong inherently with making posts and videos that are both educational and entertaining, and perhaps even more entertaining than educational, many people in the fitness industry are deeply confused about the differences between these two things, and they often sacrifice education in the name of entertainment and clicks. So this is broadly what I call edutainment, which are basically entertainment creators that pretend to be educational, which is most fitness content creators. So how do you know the difference? I don't just want to bash the whole idea, bash the industry, bash the media without giving solutions. So here are a couple simple ways to identify the differences. Number one, real education of any kind is always context defined, right? Edutainment doesn't define context. So you might be thinking, what's context? Well, context is basically just background information that helps you understand something, right? It's the word that we use to make the broad more specific, right? Creating context, unfortunately, involves more work because you need to be more precise when you speak. So if you're going to perform a proper squat, for example, you first need to define why you're squatting to begin with. The word proper makes no sense outside of a defined context. A proper squat, for example, looks very different if you're squatting for the quads or for the glutes. So in lifting, in an exercise context, you need to perform every exercise with a clear goal in mind. And if you don't have a clear goal, then what you're doing is random, and random is unlikely to work well. So again, in real education, context is always defined. And in edutainment, broad generalized statements are the default. Here's another one. Real education does not isolate and fragment concepts. Edutainment isolates and fragments concepts. Now, obviously, focusing on single concepts at a time is a necessary part of the learning process, right? But most of what happens is just regurgitation. It's not actually education, right? Real education is about taking many different parts and combining them to understand the whole of something. And when you understand the whole, you understand how to navigate any scenario within the whole, right? You don't need to memorize facts. You don't need to memorize quips because you can problem solve by thinking in principles. And so when concepts are taught and fragmented and isolated from the whole, they basically serve to do nothing, right? They lose meaning entirely, and they often don't help you beyond the very specific context which weren't defined to begin with. Again, edutainment doesn't define context. So, for example, it's common basically for people to say something like, the stretch is the most important part of any lift. The stretch is the most hypertrophic. Oh my gosh, if you don't get it, what will happen? And they often do this kind of thing at the neglect of all of their variables like resistance, direction, stability, comfort, pain reduction, and all of the other exercises that someone is actually doing. Right, so these edutainment creators basically isolate and fragment the concept of the stretch as if it's more important than every other variable that's conceivable. And this is entertaining and it appears educational, but it actually distracts people from learning anything, right? Because the viewer stays stuck in this cycle of needing to learn more isolated, fragmenting concepts instead of actually developing skills that allow people to problem solve independently, right? Which is exactly what the edutainment creator wants. They want returning viewers every single time. So what they need to do is isolate and fragment concepts and put certain concepts on a pedestal above all others instead of identifying how the concept fits into the broader scope of lifting, because that's not as fun and not as entertaining. And so instead of understanding that everything has a positive and negative side, people just sort of blindly see concepts as good or bad, as black or white, and they just basically can't make sense of anything outside of specific context. And they say silly things like, are squats good? Are squats bad? Well, you don't have to ask that question if you understand that context defines that answer. And this doesn't mean that you can't focus on single concepts. You have to do one thing at a time, but it does mean that anything that is truly educational will always make its way back to some bigger picture, some more reasonable, cohesive whole picture. So back to the broader concept. When the concept of, say, a stretch position exercise is isolated and fragmented from everything else, saying this is the best, these are the best exercises, right? Instead of understanding the potential utility of training in the stretch position, right, and how a stretch focus exercise may fit into a program, which by the way could be hugely beneficial, the viewer's takeaway is basically just the stretch is the most important variable of all. And this manifests in bad questions. Yes, they exist. Like, why are you doing this exercise? It doesn't fully stretch the muscle. As if any exercise that doesn't fully stretch the muscle is inherently bad. So real education is contextualized and it always makes reference to the whole. If you don't understand why something is relevant, you haven't actually learned anything. So here's a really important takeaway. Real education does not overstate the importance of single variables or lead people to think that some aspects of training are incredibly more important than others, right? Real education is not flashy, but it's the only thing that will actually help you problem solve when you bump into hard objects along your quest to make gains. And so I hope this was helpful and it didn't just seem like some kind of bashing video against the industry. And I hope I do a somewhat decent job of not fragmenting concepts, not isolating concepts too much in any of my videos. That's ultimately my goal, is to teach you all specific concepts, but to always relate them back to the bigger picture and to always make sure that contexts are defined within each video, and to not basically sacrifice the education for any kind of entertainment, gimmicky thing just to get more clicks, more likes, and more views. And I want to make something really, really clear. If you're someone who likes to watch videos on YouTube that are like lifting education based or really lifting edutainment based, that's totally fine. If that's like what you recognize to be your goal, your context, then that's perfect. There's no problem with that whatsoever. As long as you are aware of what you were doing and why you were doing it, no problem whatsoever. I watch mindless, brainless things all the time just because they're entertaining. So it's important to recognize that it's not inherently bad that this edutainment content creation phenomenon exists, but it is important to recognize the difference between edutainment and education, because if you're thinking that you're learning stuff all the while asking, again, bad questions like, are squats good? Well, you're kind of missing the picture. So just make sure that you can understand the difference between the two, and make sure that you're not watching one when you think you're watching the other.